While the whole world knows how Anne Boleyn died, few can imagine what she endured during her last night on Earth. 17 hours of psychological torture proved more horrifying than a single sword stroke. May 19th, 1536. Tomorrow morning, King Henry VIII's second wife would lose her head on the scaffold. But today she was still alive, locked in a stone chamber in the Tower of London, and every minute stretched like an eternity. What happened during these final hours was carefully hidden by her contemporaries. Too much truth could have shattered the legend of a righteous execution of a heretic. Why does Anne Boleyn's story still captivate millions of people? Because her fate perfectly embodies how quickly a person's life can crumble when they find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yesterday, Queen of England; today, condemned to death. The modern world is full of similar stories. Politicians, businessmen, celebrities who lose everything in a single day. But few consider what goes through a person's mind during those final hours before catastrophe strikes. Traditional historiography focused on the political reasons for Anne Boleyn's execution: Henry's need for a male heir, religious conflicts, court intrigues. But the psychological aspect of her final hours remained in the shadows. Only in recent decades have historians begun reconstructing what actually happened in the condemned woman's cell. The main sources are records from the Tower's jailer, letters from contemporaries, and witness testimonies that were long considered unreliable. The reason was simple. The authorities of that time had no interest in the public learning about the Queen's suffering. The official version stated that Anne Boleyn accepted her fate with dignity and repentance. Reality proved far more brutal. Anne Boleyn spent 18 days in the Tower, from May 2nd to May 19th. During the first days, she still hoped for a pardon. The king changed his decisions as often as he changed wives. But by May 18th, it became clear. Tomorrow, she would die. That's when they informed her of the exact time of execution and brought her a confessor. What does a person do when they learn they have less than 24 hours to live? Modern psychology knows the answer. Denial sets in, followed by anger, bargaining, depression, and finally, acceptance. But Anne Boleyn didn't have time to go through all these stages. 17 hours was too little for psychological adaptation to death, yet too much to avoid going mad with terror. The chamber where the Queen spent her last night still exists today. It's a room measuring 10 by 13 feet with a single window overlooking Tower Bridge. Stone walls, a wooden bed, table, chair. No luxury for a woman who had ruled England for 3 years. They even took away her personal linens and jewelry to prevent any temptation to bribe guards or harm herself. But the physical conditions weren't the worst part. The real torture began when darkness fell. The night of May 18th was unusually quiet. The usual noise of London, merchants' cries, wheels clattering on cobblestones, barking dogs, died down by midnight. But in the Tower, the silence was special, ominous. The only sounds were guards' footsteps in the corridors and distant cries from prisoners in other cells. Anne sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window. Behind the glass, clouds slowly drifted past, covering and revealing the moon. Each time moonlight flooded the chamber, the Queen would shudder. She probably remembered other nights. At Greenwich Palace, when she fell asleep beside the king who had now signed her death warrant. Prison chaplain Father John Skip later recalled that around midnight, Anne asked him to read a prayer, not the usual prayer for the dying, but one she had heard as a child in France. The Lord's Prayer in French sounded softer, warmer than the English version, as if she was trying to return to a time when death seemed a distant abstraction. But prayer didn't help. An hour after midnight, Anne began pacing her cell from corner to corner. 7 steps in one direction, turn 7 steps back. The guards heard these footsteps until dawn, the monotonous clicking of heels on stone floor, like counting down the final hours of life. What does a woman think, knowing that in a few hours she'll be no more? Anne Boleyn left us one clue, a note found under her bed after the execution. Just a few lines in French. God, save my daughter from her mother's fate. May she never know what it means to love a king. These words reveal Anne's greatest fear during her last night. not the pain from the sword's blow, not the shame of public execution, but 3-year-old Elizabeth's fate. What would happen to the girl when her mother was declared a traitor and heretic? Could she ever become queen, or would she repeat her mother's fate? History showed that Anne's fears weren't unfounded. Elizabeth did indeed become queen, one of the greatest in England's history. But the path to the throne proved long and full of dangers. And it all began on that very night when her mother paced the prison cell, unable to sleep. By 4 a.m, strength left the queen. She sat on the floor, leaning against the cold wall, and for the first time that night, she wept. Not loudly, not hysterically, quietly, hopelessly. The tears of a woman who understood she had lost the most important game of her life. Dawn on May 19th began at 5:43 in the morning. The first rays of sunlight penetrated the cell through the barred window, illuminating Anne Boleyn's exhausted face. Less than 5 hours remained until her execution. The morning of May 2nd, 1536 began like any other. Anne was having breakfast in her chambers at Greenwich Palace, planning her day, unaware that in a few hours her life would split into before and after. The Queen was discussing with her ladies-in-waiting an upcoming tournament in which King Henry VIII himself was to participate. The first warning sign was the tournament's cancellation. The king suddenly left the field without explaining why. Anne waited for his return until evening, but Henry never appeared. Instead, guards came with an arrest warrant. The wording was concise: on suspicion of high treason and adultery. Imagine this moment. A woman who 3 years earlier had been the desired bride of Europe's most powerful monarch suddenly found herself under arrest in her own palace. No explanations, no chance to defend herself. Simply an order to follow armed men who had bowed to her as queen just yesterday. Anne demanded a meeting with her husband. She was refused. Then she asked to see her daughter, 3-year-old Elizabeth. Refused again. The queen found herself in the position of an ordinary suspect, stripped of all privileges and rights. This was the first blow to her psyche. Instant transformation from ruler to prisoner. The journey from Greenwich to the Tower took about 2 hours. Anne rode in a closed carriage, surrounded by an escort. Through the windows, she could see the faces of curious Londoners who had already heard rumors about the Queen's arrest. Some shouted insults, others silently watched the passing procession. According to Sir William Kingston, the Tower's constable, Anne maintained outward calm during the journey. She sat straight, looked ahead, and showed no emotion. But her hands trembled, and her lips were tightly pressed together. She looked like someone trying to wake up from a bad dream. Kingston recorded in his diary. The Tower gates opened before the royal carriage at exactly 7 in the evening. The same fortress where Anne had once prepared for her coronation now welcomed her as a prisoner. The irony was compounded by the fact that 3 years ago she had spent a night here before her triumphant procession through London. Now she was returning to await death. The charges brought against Anne were staggering in their absurdity, even by 16th century standards. The Queen was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. Among the alleged lovers were musician Mark Smeaton, courtiers Henry Norris and William Brereton, and poet Sir Thomas Wyatt. Each accusation was carefully documented. Cromwell and his assistants specified exact dates and locations of the supposed betrayals. For example, it was claimed that on October 6, 1534, Anne had betrayed her husband with Norris at Westminster Palace. The problem was that on that day, the Queen was in Richmond, 12 miles from the capital. There were numerous such inconsistencies, but this bothered no one. The main goal wasn't establishing truth, but creating legal grounds for execution. English law of that time required specific charges with indication of place and time of the crime. Cromwell conscientiously fulfilled this formality, even if the facts contradicted each other. Particularly cynical was the accusation of relations with her brother. Incest was considered not merely a crime, but an abomination contrary to divine laws. This charge was meant to finally blacken Anne in the eyes of subjects and clergy. George Boleyn was a popular courtier, poet, and diplomat. His reputation also required destruction. The most cruel aspect of the charges were claims that Anne had planned the king's murder. According to witness testimony, the queen had discussed with her lovers the possibility of poisoning Henry VIII. This transformed her from an unfaithful wife into a state traitor, which automatically carried the death penalty. The psychological impact of these accusations on Anne is hard to overestimate. A woman who had sincerely loved her husband, at least during the first years of their relationship, suddenly found herself accused of planning his murder. A queen who prided herself on her virtue and religiousness became a whore and heretic. Anne spent her first week in the Tower in a state of shock. She refused food, slept poorly, and constantly asked about her daughter's fate. Kingston noted in reports to the king that the prisoner was in confusion of mind and speaks incoherently about the past. Gradually, Anne began to grasp the reality of her situation. The king wasn't going to save her. On the contrary, he was already openly courting Jane Seymour and planning a new wedding. The charges were fabricated, but that didn't matter. Political necessity demanded her death, and nothing could change that decision. It was then, around May 10th, that Anne first realized she might die. Not theoretically, not in the distant future, but in the coming days or weeks. This thought became a source of panic that would haunt her until the very end. The stone walls of the Tower fortress had seen many noble prisoners, but few had fallen as far as Anne Boleyn. The chamber where the queen spent the last 18 days of her life was located in the queen's house, a special building for distinguished prisoners. The room measured 13 by 16 feet, with a single window overlooking the inner courtyard. The conditions formally befitted her royal status. Anne had a bed with a straw mattress, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and even a small fireplace for warmth. Compared to ordinary prison cells, this was luxury. But psychologically, such conditions proved more cruel than an outright dungeon. Imagine this. You're accustomed to palace apartments, hundreds of servants, daily entertainments, and constant attention. Now your world has shrunk to 200 square feet of stone floor and ceiling. No one except guards and female warders. No news except rumors that sometimes seep through the walls. 4 women assigned to her as companions played a special role in the prisoner's life. Officially, they were supposed to care for the queen and support her morale. In reality, their task was observation and reporting on Anne's every word and gesture. These warders were Lady Kingston, wife of the fortress constable, Lady Boleyn, Mrs. Cozen, and Mrs. Stoner. All 4 belonged to families loyal to the king and hostile to the disgraced queen. The choice was deliberate. Cromwell wanted detailed reports on the prisoner's mental state. Daytime hours could still be filled somehow. Anne read her prayer book, which she was allowed to keep. She embroidered, the only needlework for which materials were considered safe. Sometimes she tried to converse with the warders, though they answered monosyllabically and reluctantly. But with nightfall, the real torments began. Sleepless nights became the curse of Anne's final weeks. In the complete silence of the stone chamber, every sound seemed threatening. Guards' footsteps in the corridor might mean they had come for her. The creak of a key in the lock made her heart beat faster. Even ordinary London night sounds, dogs barking, drunks shouting, hoofbeats, reminded her of that world she might never see again. Lady Kingston recorded in her diary, "Her Majesty spends nights pacing the chamber and talking quietly to herself. Sometimes she cries, sometimes laughs for no reason. At times it seems she's talking to people who aren't there." Modern psychology would easily recognize these symptoms as signs of acute stress and beginning depression. A person deprived of familiar surroundings and faced with the threat of death inevitably experiences such reactions. But in the 16th century, such behavior was interpreted as a sign of guilt or divine punishment. Sundays were especially hard for Anne. On these days, organ sounds and choir singing drifted from nearby St. Peter's Church. The queen listened to familiar psalm melodies that had once played at her coronation. Now the same music reminded her of lost grandeur and approaching judgment. Food in prison was simple but adequate. Bread, meat, beer, sometimes fruit. Anne ate little and reluctantly. Over 18 days of imprisonment, she noticeably lost weight, which worried even the guards. Kingston noted in a letter to the king, "The Queen loses strength each day. I fear she may not survive until trial." This phrase reveals the cynical calculation of the prison administration. Anne had to appear in court in proper condition so the process would look legal and just. An emaciated, half-mad woman might evoke sympathy from spectators and cast doubt on the charges. The prisoner's physical condition indeed caused concern. She developed headaches, nausea, and trembling fits. A doctor who examined Anne in mid-May diagnosed disorder of vital humors from excess bile. In modern terms, this meant nervous exhaustion and the onset of psychosomatic illnesses. The most painful ordeal was news about the fate of her alleged accomplices. One by one, men accused of relations with the Queen were arrested. Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Sir Francis Weston, all found themselves in neighboring cells awaiting trial and inevitable execution. Particularly painful was news of her brother's arrest. George Boleyn wasn't just a relative. He remained one of the few people at court who sincerely supported Anne. His accusation of incest meant the Queen no longer had allies even in her own family. Anne requested permission to see her brother. She was refused on the pretext that accomplices shouldn't communicate with each other. Then she asked to send George a note. Refused again. The Queen found herself in complete isolation, deprived even of the chance to say goodbye to her closest people. By mid-May, it became clear that the trial would be a formality. Witnesses had already given testimony. The indictment was ready. Jurors were selected from among the Boleyn family's enemies. Anne could only wait for her summons to the courtroom for sentencing. Nights grew longer and more torturous. Anne lay on her straw mattress, listening to fortress sounds. Somewhere nearby, guards snored, gates creaked, wind howled through tower openings. And through all these sounds came one, the most terrible, the rhythmic hammering. Somewhere in the courtyard, carpenters were building a scaffold for her execution. May 15th brought Anne Boleyn her last illusion of hope. On this day, Archbishop Cranmer came to her cell, the man who had married her to the king and baptized little Elizabeth. If anyone could influence Henry VIII's decision, it was this prelate who enjoyed the monarch's special trust. Thomas Cranmer looked embarrassed and depressed. He avoided the prisoner's direct gaze and spoke quietly, as if afraid the guards might overhear. The archbishop brought not comfort, but another blow. The king required recognition of the marriage's invalidity. Only then could Anne hope for life imprisonment instead of a death sentence. Imagine the cynicism of this proposal. The woman was asked to declare that her 3-year marriage had been illegal from the very beginning. This would automatically make Elizabeth illegitimate and strip the girl of inheritance rights. For the phantom possibility of saving her own life, Anne was supposed to destroy her only daughter's future. Cranmer explained the logic of this demand. The marriage to Anne had been canonically problematic from the start. The Queen was closely related to Mary Boleyn, the king's previous mistress. Church law forbade marrying the sister of a former concubine without special papal permission, and no one had obtained such permission. The legal underpinning was even more cynical. Henry VIII wanted to marry Jane Seymour without waiting for Anne's execution. But if the king's second marriage was recognized as valid, then a new marriage would constitute bigamy, a crime against divine and human laws. It was simpler to declare Anne a mistress rather than a lawful wife. Anne listened to the archbishop's proposal and asked for time to think. She was given 2 days, until May 17th. This period became one of agonizing oscillation between maternal love and self-preservation instinct. On one hand, life, even in prison, offered hope. Kings changed their minds, political situations could shift, a new monarch might show mercy. As long as Anne lived, she had a chance to someday see her daughter, perhaps even help her in the future. On the other hand, agreeing to annul the marriage meant betraying everything she had fought for over the past 10 years. Anne had risen from court-lady-in-waiting to queen, changed Europe's religious map, challenged the Pope and Emperor. Now she was being asked to admit that all these sacrifices had been in vain. The night of May 15th to 16th became one of the hardest in captivity. Lady Kingston recorded, "Her Majesty didn't sleep until dawn, paced the chamber, and talked loudly to herself. At times it seemed she was arguing with an invisible interlocutor, proving something very important. Anne was indeed arguing. With voices in her own head, with advice of caution and maternal love. She imagined Elizabeth's future, an illegitimate daughter of an executed traitor, stripped of title and inheritance. What prospects awaited such a girl at the court of a father who publicly cursed her mother? By the morning of May 16th, Anne had made her decision. When Cranmer came for an answer, the Queen met him with these words, "I cannot renounce what I believe to be true before God and men. My marriage was lawful, my daughter was born in wedlock, and I am prepared to die defending this truth." The Archbishop tried to persuade her. He spoke of mercy, of the possibility of repentance, of how God would forgive weakness shown to save a life. Anne listened silently, then spoke the phrase that became her spiritual testament, "Better to die a queen than live as a mistress." These words reveal the essence of Anne Boleyn's character. Despite all her flaws, ambition, pride, sometimes cruelty, she possessed a firm understanding of honor and dignity. The Queen chose death over a compromise that would have saved her life at the cost of betraying her own principles. Anne's decision effectively signed her death warrant. Henry VIII had counted on her agreement and was already planning his wedding to Jane Seymour for May 20th. The Queen's refusal forced the King to act more harshly and decisively. May 17th brought news of the trial date. Anne was to appear before the kingdom's peers on May 19th in the Great Hall of the Tower. Formally, this was a real judicial process with jurors, witnesses, and defense. In practice, a spectacle with a predetermined ending. The list of judges included England's most noble names: Duke of Norfolk, the defendant's uncle, Earl of Surrey, her cousin, Lord Chancellor Audley, and 26 more peers. All had received clear instructions from the King about the desired outcome. Anyone who dared vote for acquittal risked their own head. On the evening of May 17th, Anne wrote her last letter to Henry VIII. This message hasn't survived. Royal archives of that time were carefully cleaned of inconvenient documents, but Lady Kingston saw how the Queen wrote these lines and later told of their contents. Anne didn't ask for mercy and didn't admit guilt. She wrote about the love that had once bound them, about hopes for the future they had shared, about the daughter who needed paternal protection. The Queen reminded her husband of vows made before God and the price both had paid for their union. The letter ended with a request for a meeting. Anne wanted to see one last time the man who had once been ready to turn the world upside down for her love. She hoped that a personal conversation might awaken remnants of his former feelings. Henry VIII didn't respond to this letter. Moreover, he ordered that no messages from the prisoner be delivered to him. The King had already mentally buried his second wife and was preparing for his third marriage. The past should be forgotten as quickly as possible. The night of May 18th became Anne Boleyn's last. Tomorrow she faced trial. The day after, execution. Time for illusions had run out. May 19th, 1536 began with fog. A thick veil rose from the Thames and shrouded the Tower's towers, as if nature was trying to hide the impending crime. Anne Boleyn awoke at dawn, if you could call it awakening after a sleepless night spent waiting for death. The trial took place at noon and lasted less than 3 hours. This wasn't a legal procedure, but a political spectacle designed to give the appearance of legality to an already made decision. 27 lords unanimously found Anne Boleyn guilty of high treason and adultery. The sentence read, "To be burned or beheaded at His Majesty, the King's pleasure." Returning to her cell after the trial, Anne felt a strange relief for the first time in weeks. The agonizing uncertainty was over. No more need to hope, bargain, or make escape plans. All that remained was to wait and prepare for death with maximum possible dignity. Kingston brought news of royal mercy. Instead of being burned alive, Anne would face quick death by sword. Moreover, an executioner was specially summoned from the French city of Calais, famous for the art of painless beheadings. This was the last service Henry VIII provided for the woman who had once been his passion. But even this mercy had practical calculation. An axe might require several blows, especially if the executioner missed or his hand trembled. The French master's sword guaranteed instant death with one precise movement. The king didn't want the condemned woman's suffering to evoke sympathy from spectators. The night of May 19th to 20th became Anne's last. But this night brought not despair, but surprising clarity of mind. The queen composed her spiritual will, dictated final instructions regarding her few personal possessions, and asked that her blessing be conveyed to her daughter. The priest, Father Skip, who spent Anne's final hours with her, later recalled, "Her Majesty received news of imminent death with astonishing calm. She confessed, took communion, and prayed until dawn. I saw no fear in her eyes, only sadness at leaving her daughter an orphan." This observation reveals the main feature of Anne's final hours. She was tormented not by thoughts of her own death, but by worry about Elizabeth's fate. The 3-year-old girl would be left motherless in a world where her father could change his mind about her future at any moment. Who would protect the child from court intrigues? Who would teach her to survive in the cruel world of politics? Around 4 in the morning, Anne requested paper and ink. She wrote a short letter to Elizabeth, a message her daughter should read when she became old enough. The content of this letter is unknown. The document disappeared from royal archives, but several independent sources confirm its existence. With dawn's arrival, preparations for execution began. Anne was brought a simple gray dress, the color of mourning and repentance. She refused the offered black cloak, saying, "I do not mourn my life. I mourn that my king believed lies." These words became her last public assertion of innocence. The condemned woman's toilette took unusually long. Anne carefully combed her hair and arranged it in a special way to expose her neck for the sword's blow. She put on the best jewelry she was allowed to keep, a pearl necklace and gold earrings. The queen wanted to die beautiful. At 8 in the morning, a procession approached the cell. Kingston led with the official execution order. Behind him, a priest with a cross, 4 warders, and an escort of guards. Anne met them calmly, almost with relief. The waiting was over. The path to the scaffold took only a few minutes. Anne walked slowly, head held high, not looking back at the fortress's grim walls. On Tower Green, a crowd had already gathered. Representatives of nobility, city officials, ordinary Londoners who had received permission to attend. The scaffold was a wooden platform about 3 feet high, covered with black cloth. Straw lay in the center. It was meant to absorb the condemned woman's blood. Nearby stood the executioner in a black mask, holding a long double-edged sword. History hasn't preserved his name. Masters of their craft preferred anonymity. Ascending the scaffold, Anne addressed the assembled crowd with a short speech. She didn't admit guilt, but didn't accuse the king of injustice either. "I came here to die according to law," the queen said. "Good Christian people, pray for me." Then she added more quietly, "And pray for the king. He is a good and merciful sovereign." These last words still puzzle historians. Was this sincere belief in her husband's justice? An attempt to protect her daughter from accusations of descent from a traitorous mother? Or simply following etiquette that required the condemned to bless the monarch? Anne removed her headdress and handed it to one of the warders. She pinned up her hair with pins so it wouldn't interfere with the blow. Then she knelt, folded her hands in prayer, and closed her eyes. The executioner raised his sword. "Jesus, receive my soul," whispered Anne Boleyn. These were her last words. The sword descended precisely and swiftly. The queen's head separated from her body in one movement, rolled across the wooden platform, and stopped in the straw. Death was instantaneous, exactly as the king had promised. Anne Boleyn's body was lifted and carried to St. Peter's Chapel, located 100 yards from the scaffold. There she was buried in a simple wooden coffin next to other executed traitors. No honors, no ceremonial processions. The King of England's second wife vanished from history as suddenly as she had once entered it. But Anne Boleyn's death proved not an end, but a beginning. A day later, Henry married Jane Seymour. 22 years later, the executed Queen's daughter ascended the English throne and ruled for 45 years, transforming England into a great power. Over nearly 500 years since Anne Boleyn's death, many myths have formed around her final days. Romantic literature, cinema, and popular history created an image of a proud queen who met death without fear or regret. Reality proved far more complex and human. The first myth concerns her behavior in prison. According to the widespread version, Anne maintained royal dignity and showed contempt for her enemies. In fact, documents show a woman on the verge of nervous breakdown. She cried, paced her cell, spoke incoherently, and sometimes lost touch with reality. This myth didn't arise by chance. Elizabeth I, upon becoming queen, needed a heroic image of her mother. Official historiography presented Anne as a martyr who suffered for true faith. Human weaknesses didn't fit this concept, so they were carefully silenced or distorted. The second myth relates to her attitude toward the charges. The popular version states that Anne angrily rejected all accusations and called them slander. Documentary sources paint a more nuanced picture. The Queen did indeed deny the betrayals, but sometimes doubted her own righteousness. This especially concerned her behavior with courtiers. Anne was a flirtatious, coquettish woman who loved male attention. She danced with courtiers, accepted gifts from them, engaged in frivolous conversations. Under medieval moral standards, such behavior from a married woman was considered reprehensible. Kingston recorded in his diary, "Her Majesty admits she was careless in her dealings with certain gentlemen. She regrets this, but maintains she never crossed boundaries permitted to a married woman." This admission shows that Anne understood the ambiguity of her position. The third myth concerns her last words. Romantic versions attribute to Anne a long speech about love, forgiveness, and hope for meeting in the afterlife. Her real last words were much simpler. A short prayer in Latin. No pathos, no literary flourishes, only sincere faith in the Almighty's mercy. The fourth myth relates to the king's motives. The popular version presents Henry VIII as a tyrant who executed his wife for failing to bear a son. Reality is more complex. The king needed political justification for a new marriage and church reforms. Anne became a scapegoat in a larger political game. Analysis of correspondence from that time shows that Henry did indeed have doubts about the correctness of his actions. Several times he postponed the execution, demanded additional proof of guilt, consulted with lawyers. But political logic proved stronger than personal hesitations. The fifth myth concerns society's reaction to the execution. According to widespread opinion, the people condemned the king's cruelty and sympathized with the executed queen. Contemporary sources paint the opposite picture. Most subjects supported the monarch's decision and considered the punishment just. The reason for such reaction lay in religious prejudices. Anne Boleyn was a Protestant in a Catholic country, a foreigner of French upbringing among Englishmen, an ambitious upstart in the eyes of old nobility. Her fall was perceived as restoration of justice and return to traditional values. But the main myth concerns the very essence of Anne Boleyn's final days. Traditional history focuses on political aspects of her downfall, on court intrigues and religious conflicts. This misses the main point. The psychological drama of a woman who in several weeks went from royal grandeur to the scaffold. Modern psychology allows us to better understand the torments Anne experienced in her final days. Sudden loss of status, isolation from loved ones, uncertainty about the future, fear for her daughter, all this combined into a picture of acute stress capable of breaking any person. Particularly hard to bear was the loss of control over her own fate. Anne was accustomed to influencing events, making decisions, shaping the kingdom's policy. Now she could only wait for other people's decisions about her life and death. For a powerful, active nature, this was torture worse than physical suffering. Anne Boleyn's story remains relevant today. In a world where careers collapse in a single day, where public figures become victims of political campaigns, where personal life becomes subject to public trial, her fate takes on new meaning. Any of us might find ourselves in a situation where external circumstances threaten everything we've built over years. How do we maintain dignity in the moment of fall? How do we protect loved ones when we ourselves need protection? How do we accept the inevitable without losing faith in justice? Anne Boleyn didn't provide ready answers to these questions. She was an ordinary person with weaknesses, fears, doubts. But at the most critical moment, she chose dignity over survival, honor over compromise. And in this choice lies the enduring value of her story. Anne Boleyn's last night was indeed more horrifying than her execution. 17 hours of psychological torture, struggle with despair, farewell to life proved harder than one moment of pain. But it was precisely this night that showed the true strength of character of a woman who chose to die a queen rather than live broken. A question for reflection. Are you ready to sacrifice safety for principles? Where is that line beyond which compromise becomes betrayal of oneself? Share your thoughts. History teaches us not only about the past, but how to live in the present.